All right, so I'm Dr. Eli Lieber. A little bit of background on me. I actually was, my formal education was primarily as a quantitative psychologist. I've been doing mixed methods and qualitative research actually prior to finishing my dissertation. So I really come to this work really from both sides and always with a head for the quantitative type of background. So I am definitely not a grounded theory person, so there is my bias in how I'll be talking about building a strong and useful coding system and what that looks like in your research. So qualitative data, let me step back and say that when I was in graduate school, the qualitative and quantitative people didn't talk to each other very well. There wasn't a lot of respect back and forth, and I think from the quantitative perspective, there was often criticism for the methods and then a lack of confidence in the results from purely qualitative research. And I think this comes from a great misunderstanding both of how this work has been done, and perhaps the responsibility in part lies on the qualitative researchers for not putting forth clear documentation of the methods that they've employed. So qualitative methods can be very systematic and objective, and this is certainly not true in all cases, but it's attainable, and from my perspective it's critical for good science. So these concepts and themes that are identified in qualitative data can be developed into reliable codes and later grounded distributions, and we'll talk about that. So four main things that we're going to touch on today. First of all is concept identification and conceptualization, code definition and application criteria, code application reliability testing, and then scaling protocols and rating reliability, and what that looks like in practice and why that can be valuable to your research as well. So code systems, when we develop these code systems, again, from a grounded theory perspective, people who approach their qualitative data that way, go in with this blank slate and search for these themes within the qualitative data themselves, with no conceptualization or conception of what those codes are going to look like prior to entering the data. I come from a little bit of a different background, and the answer to how to develop your codes really depends on a lot of factors, depending on the structure of the data in the approach that you take to collecting it. So is this just open-ended narratives? Are these field notes? Are these structured questions? And in most cases in the work that we're involved in our lab at UCLA, we are going into the field with some broad questions for our research participants. And so that's always a reasonable starting place to develop some a priori candidate codes. We may or may not confirm the value of them in the data, but certainly we ask questions of our participants, and so we can naturally expect to hear things from them that touch on those things, and certainly those are focused on our key research questions as well. And then, of course, we want to always be open to codes that are developed in vivo or emergent codes. So when we're entering the qualitative data, remaining open to hearing things that we might not have anticipated. Oh, Alina's reminding me to let you all know that we are recording this session, and then we'll make it available online if you want to return or share it with any of your colleagues. So there's really these two ways of initially developing these things. We come up with these candidates a priori or in vivo or emergent perspective. So code viability now and how we define these codes is really a process of hypothesis generation and testing. So it's this iterative process of, here's my idea for a valuable code, and then I go into my data and try to apply those codes, evaluate how useful they are to me, and then perhaps modify my application criteria. So what does a particular code mean? What are my criteria for necessary and sufficient conditions within the qualitative data themselves to apply those codes? And so just like in general qualitative data analysis, it's this iterative process of developing these hypotheses, testing it on the data, seeing if it really is going to help us in addressing our research questions, And through that process, the code system itself, as well as those application criteria, will evolve. And this takes place particularly early on in a research project as we're developing this conceptual framework. And one of the ways to demonstrate the attention that you pay to this is through testing on inter-rater reliability. Cohen's kappa being one statistic that provides very strong evidence that you've applied this methodological rigor in your work. And I can tell you from a methodological person's perspective, when I'm reviewing potential articles for publication, this is something that I'm looking for as a methodologist to see, go to that methods section and take a look and see what do people actually do here, and should I have confidence in the findings that they're putting forward. So I think that's an important thing to include in your manuscripts. Okay, do you get it? Document, document, document. Good code systems become this conceptual framework that you're going to use to, number one, organize your data, to explore your data, how you're going to analyze and approach it, and then how you're going to communicate your findings. So we are big on documenting in code books, writing memos inside of projects to really lay out in objective, communicable ways what our codes mean. What are the rules for when we use these codes? When do we use them? When do we not use them? And this documentation is going to be central to the methods sections when you're writing your manuscripts. So going through that process of really getting things down in formal documents and organized documents is going to set you up for how you're going to communicate the rigor of your work later on, and it's going to instill a lot more confidence both in yourself, because you will have gone through the pain and suffering and taking your team through the pain and suffering of really working these things out, and then being able to communicate that with great confidence in your manuscripts and reports. So document, 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 because you and your team are the method. From a quantitative perspective, we look for Cronbach's alpha coefficient. So when we use standardized measures and things like that, we want to look to see how do the questions in these measures hang together. So this is an internal consistency question from a quantitative perspective, and we have an analogous approach from a qualitative perspective as well. So am I applying my code system in a reliable way to my data? Have I communicated this to the people on my team, and are we doing this work consistently? And if we can accomplish that in how we approach our data, how we lead our teams in approaching the data, then we'll build up this inter-rater reliability. We'll be able to demonstrate it through Cohen's kappa coefficient, and then we'll have confidence in how we've done our work and be able to argue from a very strong perspective in when putting forth our findings. This is a tough part of qualitative research, but it's important, and that's why we really thought about putting this webinar out there, because it's something that we feel is critical to qualitative research and core to strong methodological rigor in how qualitative data are approached. So this is a challenging task. You need to work together with your team, and one of the most difficult things is to make sure that when communicating even to another colleague about your code system, how you're using it, and then getting feedback, every voice at the table needs to be equal. And the challenge here being, imagine that you're working with a team where you're a prominent professor and you have student assistants working for you. Sitting around that table, everybody needs to be heard in a respectful and at the same level. Otherwise, we're not going to have that dialogue around, hey, you know what, I don't really understand this, or that doesn't make sense to me. And everybody needs to feel comfortable to put that stuff out there so that people can be working together to have a common mind around what the themes are going to look like and how those codes are going to be applied. So you really want to build out a contextualized code application rules. That meaning when we come up with codes and ideas and definitions, that dictionary type of part of our code book, that's a relatively easy thing to do. It's relatively subjective, at least from an individual or team perspective. But when you actually dig into the data, people don't use those words. It becomes more challenging in that context, within the context of the actual data, to apply those codes. So that's where the work really needs to be done, on that iterative process of taking your ideas around what things are looking like, what the rules are for how content needs to show itself to you, where that excerpt is going to be properly coded or not. And you really need to take a lot of practice. So we build out these things early on, and then test them, practice, practice, practice. Test for inter-rater reliability. And I like to use this bell curve example for thinking about how, where the challenges lie. Okay, so your green excerpts, those are the easy ones. One code that I'm going to be talking to you today about in some of the later examples is reading by mother. So in some of the data that I'll show you later on, they come from a study that we were involved in studying families with children in Head Start schools. And we went into the homes prior to and following an intervention in the Head Start programs themselves to look at the home literacy environment. And so we asked moms in very broad terms to tell us about the home literacy environment, looking for any evidence of activities, of materials, books, art, and things like that that were surrounding this child, so we get a sense about what this child is experiencing that is going to help them develop the skills that they're going to need to learn to read. So one of the obvious themes that we developed was reading by mother. So when mom tells you she's sitting down at bedtime with her child every night and reading to her child, there's an excerpt in text that's pretty easy to plop into the reading by mother code. Okay, so those are all your green excerpts. The majority of them are pretty obvious, particularly at that level. Right, but then there's examples where mom's talking about reading a recipe out loud while her child is in the kitchen and she's cooking. So is that in or is that out? Okay, so here's where we get to our yellow excerpts and our red excerpts, and we need to decide as a team what are the rules, what's in and what's out. Mom's reading, the child's hearing, and so as a team we decide where that excerpt is going to fall, inside or outside the reading by mother code. Okay, so it's nice to think about, and when we start talking about different levels of codes, those boundaries can get fuzzier and fuzzier. So what makes a good code system? Well, this is going to depend really on two things. What's your story? What, at the end of the day, what is the story that you want to be able to tell? And you know what your research question is when you design your study. You have your idea about your methods, whether you're collecting short answers or narrative interviews, focus groups, observations. And as we develop the idea for our story, we want to make sure that as we go into our data, we reach some level of saturation that we're comfortable with. So we want to get to a point where our code system is capturing everything that's important to us, everything that is available in our data, and to a level of which we're going to be able to tell our story with a certain level of confidence. Okay, so talk about three levels of codes here. Okay, a parent code or flat codes. So I'm going to talk about these things. Sorry, I got distracted by a note here. Teach me to monitor a little bit better. So just stepping back for a second, Peter asks, how can an individual researcher test for reliable code systems? And so, you know, this is often the case with graduate students who are working individually, but I would strongly encourage just find a friend. I mean, if you're in grad school, there's other people around you that are struggling with the same challenges. And spend some time working through your code system. And I think, Peter, as I talk a little bit more about this, hopefully it'll illuminate my ideas about how far you want to take this exercise. But I do think it's important, and you want to be able to get feedback. because ultimately you're going to be putting forward your research, and you're going to want to know that people on the other end are looking at this as solid evidence and not just simply anecdotal stories. So good parent code. So this is really the skeleton to our code system. Good parent codes are typically easier to apply in reliable ways. Okay, so these are broader codes. Sometimes we even talk about them as indexing. So in our literacy study, we have codes like reading by mother, reading by others. These are fairly easy things for us to go in, grab large sections of content from these interviews, and then tag with these broader themes. A good parent code is something that we're going to use broadly across the research population. Okay, so we're not simply going to be using this code in some particular subset or here and there. It's a good code because it's telling us something about the broader population, and this is what the study's for, right? Assuming that we're not doing case study types of work. And so again, and then I think finally, these broad codes really define these major concepts that speak to the research question. So again, it's always a good idea to continue to reflect on, at the end of the day, what's the story I want to tell. I'm going to write up a manuscript that's going to have a certain number of sections, and those sections are these skeleton code headers, right? So reading by mother, I'm going to tell you about what we heard from these parents with children in Head Start schools around the episodes where mothers were reading to their children. That's going to be a section in our manuscript. So beneath that now we have the child codes. Okay, so this is where I'm thinking in terms of building out our animal here, is the meat on the bones. Okay, so these are slightly more nuanced and sometimes harder to apply in reliable ways. That's the challenge for you. Okay, so within these reading by mother episodes, what other kinds of things might we see? We might see people talking about reading routines, looking at differences in the length of reading episodes, the quality of reading episodes, and how do we determine that? So here we start to get into more detail and more richness. So while our skeleton codes are going to be those main headers in our manuscript, the child codes are really going to help bring out that richness. Okay, so that's where we're really going to tell the story. So again, skeleton codes more, or the parent codes as the organizers, but the rich, nuanced, contextualized story, that's something that we might be capturing more at the level of child codes. Excuse me for a second. So then grandchild codes, great-grandchild codes, great-great-great-grandchild codes, and slash tags. And the reason that I throw the word tag in here is that in a lot of the work that we do, and certainly I think that there's some leaning for more quantitative people to use more codes in their code tree than people who are sort of pulling up to broader levels. So sometimes we really want to tag content that might pop out that's interesting to us. It might seem like a valuable piece of information, but it's really something idiosyncratic to a particular individual in our study. And so here we're sort of talking about the dressing, right? Very much more nuanced, idiosyncratic types of variation. These are much harder to apply in reliable ways because they are so idiosyncratic. These grandchild, great-grandchild codes tags might be representing interesting kinds of information, but often more anecdotal. Okay, we use them very much less frequently, and they can be useful in tagging content for later retrieval, but we might not want to consider them proper codes. Okay, and so when I mean distinguish between tags and codes, and in a coding system they're still going to exist in the same form, we're not going to worry so much about inter-rater reliability at this level. Okay, so they can be used in a project to retrieve information that we might want to get to, but we're not going to hang our hats on that in terms of strong methods. So certainly there's no problem having these types of codes slash tags in our code system, but we really have to think hard about the status that we bring them to. One of the most challenging kinds of things is to work with teams where they have many more and more nuanced codes, and helping them get to a level where there is acceptable inter-rater reliability. So one of the things that we often think about doing is that how we get more and more detailed in the types of codes that we're developing, they can be harder and harder for your team to build these grading, these application criteria around. And so sometimes it's wiser to sort of pull up the tree a little bit. Okay, so if we get down to such minutia where we're having those challenges, that might be the clue there, or the red flag that tells us this is not a good code. This is not something I want to hang my hat on in terms of what I'm going to argue is evidence in my story, but it can certainly color my story. So we might want to just then pull up the tree, and as we're working to develop inter-rater reliability, we're not doing that at this grandchild/code level or tag level. We're pulling up towards child codes. And so as you work with your candidate codes, particularly early on, the difficulty with which you establish this inter-rater reliability is a really nice clue for what's going to be a good code for you. So sometimes you're going to develop these more nuanced codes, and you'll find as you really approach your data that it's too difficult to distinguish one from another, when to apply them. So in those cases, we're going to want to merge those codes together. So as you're working through this iterative process, there's all kinds of information for us, particularly as we're trying to communicate to others what we mean when we're tagging content with a particular code. Whether that's really going to be a place that we're going to be able to find consistent and reliable evidence in our data to tell our story later on. Pardon me. All right, so what's next? So code dimension identification and development. So this is something that may not be familiar to you. It is a mixed method element to the work that we've been involved in at UCLA, and certainly is fundamental to Dedoose. But it can be of great value to your work. So the idea here being that we can often develop dimensions around our codes. So the example of reading by mother, to pull on that, what we did with reading by mother codes, we sat around with our team. We pulled out excerpts that were coded with the reading by mother code. And we went through an iterative pile sorting procedure to see if we could develop some distribution of what we interpreted as quality of reading practice. So everybody on the team would have a pile of excerpts. We'd build 3 piles at the first pass: high, medium, and low. So can we identify excerpts that we would individually classify as low quality, medium quality, and high quality reading episodes? Okay, and that first pass in a situation like this is typically fairly easy. Okay, so mothers that tell us they're illiterate and they don't read and the child's too young to read anyway, they're not worried about it, that's a low episode around mother reading to her child. In fact, she's not. Then we have mothers that tell us they read every day without fail at bedtime for sure, for at least 30 minutes, the child loves it, high quality reading episode. And then the rest is sort of this mush in the middle. And then what we did with that mush in the middle was take those piles and did the same thing again. Took them and said, okay, among this middle group, can we come up with high, medium, and low quality? So in the end, we developed a 5-point rating system. And we worked very hard to refine these criteria, and again, testing reliability on how our team applied 2s and 3s and 4s, rules for what distinguished a 3 from a 4, what's necessary for that 4 to be applied. You can test inter-rater or inter-rating reliability using Pearson's correlation coefficient. And so then as we apply these, we pull these excerpts back out of our data set, and then we can tag them with the appropriate rating. So these well-developed and reliably applied code ratings facilitate data integration. So there's a lot of things we can do from a mixed methods perspective when we can apply these types of dimensions. These dimensions are arbitrary, so they can indicate things like importance or centrality, quality, anything that you can think of as a dimension. Marketing people talk about sentiment ratings and so forth. So these are things that are not necessarily applicable to all codes in your code system, but where you can develop them, they can let you do some kind of interesting things. All right, so here I'm going to stretch your heads out just a little bit, push the boundaries here. So when we think about using these grounded dimensions, excuse me, we talk about them as grounded because these rating scales have grown off of the qualitative data and the work that you've done from a coding perspective. So if we just look at column A over here, this is traditional qualitative data analysis, all right? So we have interviews with moms about the home literacy environment in our exemplar study, transcribe them, identify those themes, and develop these rating systems, go back into our data and apply them, those themes across all of the research participants. And then we use those organized coded data to search, filter, extract text, and then interpret that to tell our story. But if we look at arrow B, here's where we talk about building these dimensions, okay? So when we have our themes built out and we feel confident in how we can communicate them and apply them to the data in reliable ways, we can then work to identify these grounded dimensions for, again, key concepts, not necessarily every code in our code system, okay? But we can certainly use these dimensions in very reliable ways. And then we can look to examine those dimensions from psychometric perspectives. Arrow C connects us to traditional quantitative data. So where we have a mixed method study where we might be interviewing people, but we also have demographics, ratings, other types of quantitative data, we can integrate these dimensions that we've developed from the qualitative data in traditional quantitative data analysis. And then our D arrows, kind of going back both from traditional quant data analysis to informing new research questions from a qualitative perspective, certainly working the other way, then we can integrate using these grounded dimensions to reach back into our qualitative data. So where we might take this reading by mother quality, integrate it with quantitative data, carry out some analyses. Perhaps we find there's differences in rating quality as a function of the gender of the child in a family, and we see that from a quantitative perspective. But if that was purely a quant study, that would be where the story would end. We'd have to speculate on why we found that particular relationship. But when we have these dimensions that are grounded on the qualitative data, we can use them to return to the qualitative data because we know so much more about these families and then begin to ask many other types of questions. So, whoopsie, sorry. So when we have these dimensions, here's some different and kind of interesting things that we can put forward in our studies. So we can look at, from an experimental perspective, change in the quality of mother reading practices from pre to post intervention. Okay, so this is an illustration of variation that we found in reading quality, and fortunately in our study there was an improvement in mother's reading practices following this intervention, and so we see this distributional shift where we have a much more high rating skewed types of quality, and again as interpreted by the research team, not by self-report. These data are also very interesting to be used when we do have self-report. Okay, so we can ask moms, hey, on a scale of 1 to 5, tell me what's the strength of your reading practices at home. We'll have these self-report data, but we can also then take our investigator-imposed ratings on that same scale based on the qualitative data and say, you know, here's our interpretation of quality for a particular family. And we can compare how well those things line up. That can certainly bring interesting perspectives into your data analysis. So here's one way that we can use them. And certainly if we have an experiment, then we can break these out both by experimental and control perspectives. So when we've applied these types of ratings, we can begin to use them to tell very different kinds of stories from both a quantitative and qualitative perspective. So that's the end of my slideshow for you. And so now I wanted to take a moment to show you what this all looks like in Dedoose. Excuse me. So I know that many of you are Dedoose users already, so these data should be a little bit familiar to you. Everybody who signs up for Dedoose gets a copy of a subset of our demonstration data that come from this literacy study. And so we have built out here our code system. So this lower left panel is where our code system it has been built out. And we have a very general code reading by others. But let's say that we've gone into our study. Let me just pull up a document here. So we've gone into our data, and perhaps we begin to find excerpts where here the target child's sister will read to him because she knows how to read. In English, she reads whenever the target child asks her to, which is about 2 to 3 times per week. So I have a reading by others code in my code system. But what I might start to begin to think about is, well, we have reading by mother. And let me fold up the tree to keep this a little bit clearer here. We have reading by mother, and then we have this general reading by others code. And I might start thinking about things like, there's a difference between reading by siblings or reading by as a friend or a babysitter. So I might want to add a new code to my code system. So one of the things that we can do very easily in Dedoose is activate our relatively new quick code widget by clicking on my spacebar. And using the quick code widget, I can do a search. So here's my read by sibling. So as I type read by sibling into the search field here, I can see that I've narrowed myself down to 0. This code doesn't yet exist. By simply hitting my enter key here, I could add that read by sibling to my code system, create an excerpt in that region, and I've coded that particular excerpt with the read by sibling code. And so I can use that quick code widget to simply work through my tree. But this read by sibling really is something that's a child code to the reading by other code. So while I can't do that in my quick code widget, I can go into my code tree over here. I'm going to hit edit codes by hitting this little cog icon. And then I can take this read by sibling code and drag it and drop it onto reading by other to create a subcode there. So it's very easy with the code editing in Dedoose to add new codes to your code system as they emerge from the data. So these would be our emergent or in vivo type of coding. And then it's very easy for me to go and change the hierarchical structure of the tree. So as I go through my data and explore further, I might then decide, reading by sibling is not distinguishing in any important ways from reading by others. So I'd like to group that data or those data together. So again, when I'm in my editing mode for codes, I can go ahead and edit this particular code, choose to merge it, choose reading by others as the primary code, and then submit that and accept my warning that these data will be recoded. So I just wanted to show you that to demonstrate that within the Dedoose environment, and I think with any software or code system, you should have the flexibility to expand, contract, and change the structure of the code system, because naturally this is part of what's going to happen early on in the study, and whatever environment you're working with should facilitate your ability to do that as easily as possible. And then also thinking about the idea that the codes in your code system and the hierarchical structure of your code system, as we've talked about, have major implications for your later data analysis. One other thing I wanted to point out here from a best practices perspective is that in our studies we will always have something like great quotes or best excerpts as a code in our code system. And so the idea behind that being that when we're writing up our manuscripts, we're certainly going to talk about, for example, reading by mother. So I'm going to tell you these stories about reading by mother. I'm going to talk about what we found across our research population, but I'm not going to quote everybody. And so when we use the great quotes code, in our analysis, it can be very easy for us to then find those nuggets that we want to draw on, because there are some times when people communicate things around our themes in very eloquent ways, that they really capture what it is that we're trying to communicate, and better to bring their voices to the manuscripts than to simply speak about it from a research perspective. So what does this look like from an analysis point of view? Let me go back home here. So one of the things that we might want to do in our analysis is simply pull up all the excerpts that we've tagged with a particular code so that we can look at them as a series and investigate further and perhaps develop more nuanced codes and then decide how and when we want to apply them, as well as pull up codes and then go through this rating criteria as we've developed those types of dimensions. So here in the Dedoose environment, we have our reading by mother code. There's an excerpts icon that appears when I'm floating over that code in the code tree. And I'm going to just pull up those excerpts. So this is the fastest way to get to all the excerpts tagged with particular code. From here, I can export these to Word so I can use them, or Excel, so I can use them locally in writing up my manuscripts. But I can also open them up as a series here and use my next and previous buttons to scroll through them. So here's where I might start thinking about applying more nuanced codes. So if we pass through our data at that broad level, and I guess this is something I should have mentioned earlier on, we will commonly start with those parent codes in our studies. Okay, so we'll pass through our data, we'll develop these broader codes, and then apply them to our data. Okay, and so then within these parent codes, as we've explored the data and gone through the process of applying them, we develop a much more intimate familiarity with the data. And it's through that process that we're going to develop these more nuanced child codes. In this study, for example, things like duration of reading, routine reading, frequency of reading over the course of a week. So these might be things that we now see within the reading by mother episodes. And we might want to then just add them to our code system, pull up all the broader excerpts that we've tagged with reading by mother, and then apply the more nuanced child and grandchild codes as we just go through them on a series basis. So it can, again, because of the challenge or level of difficulty of applying the more nuanced codes, it's often beneficial to the team and through the process of taking a solid pass through your qualitative data, hitting it at that skeletal level in developing these reliable codes, and then working your way down into more nuanced and detailed type of codes. So it's very easy then within the Dedoose environment to pull these up and then begin to apply the more nuanced codes. So here we see we have reading by mother. Perhaps we see that mom's also talking about routine reading, so I can apply that code by double-clicking on it. Perhaps she's talking about bedtime reading, and so I'll apply that code as well. And you can also see here in this attached codes panel that where we've activated our our rating systems, I have my opportunity here to go through and change those ratings. And so often early on, and again in this iterative fashion, it's easy to tag content at this broader level. So we're going to grab all the reading by mother content and tag it with reading by mother code. Through that process, we're doing two things if we're going to apply rating systems. One is developing these more nuanced child codes, and the other is developing that rating system. Okay? It's not something that we should expect to have a feeling for early on in the study. Okay, so we know we're going to have reading by mother content, but we don't know what that rating system is going to look like. So we can always activate it later on, and then in this same fashion as applying child codes, once we have a nice solid grounding on the code, the rating criteria, then we can just go through all the excerpts one by one and apply the appropriate rating. Okay, so as we go through them, we can see we have reading by mother, default value is 5, but this one's a 2. So we can just go through them excerpt by excerpt and set those data through this additional pass through our qualitative data. So there's just pulling the excerpts for a particular code up. So let me jump into the Dedoose Analyze workspace. The first thing I will take you to is our code co-occurrence matrix. And here's one of the matrices in the analytic features where we can easily pull up excerpts that have been tagged with 2 codes in our code system. And so here's a simple way that we can take advantage of our great quotes code. So this cell in the upper right corner with the 14 shows me there were 14 excerpts where we tagged the content with reading by mother and great quotes. Okay, so I might pull up all the reading by mother excerpts to tell my broader story, but when I want to get to those nuggets that I really want to quote, I can just hit this cell and it'll pull up that subset of, and here we've got a bunch of video and audio files actually, or excerpts. And that's very easy for me to then just pull those out and use them as those illustrative quotes in my manuscripts and report. Pardon me. So other ways that we can take advantage of our coding and our code weighting. Here is, within the Dedoose environment, an example of where we can take advantage of these code weight systems. I'm going to choose child gender as my demographic field. So here we can see that for the reading by mother code, we have a various distribution of excerpts that have been tagged with particular weights for reading by mother, and how these vary by the child gender. Perhaps more interesting actually in this study would be for me to choose the phase. So here we're seeing how that distribution of scores has changed as a function of the time point in the study. So when we have a longitudinal study where we're interviewing research participants, in this case these mothers with children in Head Start schools, multiple times, we want to look at how our ratings for quality of reading practices has changed as a function of time. These time variables in Dedoose, we have a special case, we call them dynamic descriptors, and that's for an entirely different webinar. But the nice thing here is that we can get a data visualization that we can use to communicate this change across the course of the study. So we see an increase of quality that follow, or a decrease in quality of episodes at follow-up. So perhaps there's an intervention, but we had some drop-off of the effects. All the data visualizations in Dedoose can be exported to Excel by using this little export icon in the upper right corner. So I would click on that, save it locally as an Excel file. I'm not going to do that. It's ready to plop into a presentation or a manuscript. And then again, all of the data visualizations are linked to the underlying data. So if I find that this particular group is interesting to me, I can just click on it and pull up the underlying. There's one excerpt there that we coded at follow-up with a weight of 1. So there's a variety of data visualizations in Dedoose, these matrices, that are designed both to help you identify patterns in your data, communicate those patterns to your research audience, and then use them to drill into the underlying content. So tapping into all of that rich qualitative data and what you've done with those data surrounding your code system. So we have about 15 minutes here, and I just wanted to stop and give you some opportunities to pose questions. So Elena has nothing coming in. So at this point then, let me turn to show you a couple of other things that we have implemented into Dedoose to familiarize you with features that are designed around supporting the development of these strong code systems. And I have one question that's come in. That's an extensive one. Sorry, reading through this. Okay, so Ed's asking, in researching people's fears, frustration, challenges, do you use the answers as the child codes? And so that's entirely up to you, Ed. I think that I think you have to be really thoughtful to and open to working through your data in iterative ways. So, and again, playing on the structure of your code system. So if I'm getting this right, you're talking about tagging content related to fears in general, frustrations in general, and then using child codes to get at the variations in fears. And I would say that if I'm on it, that's exactly how I would suggest that you approach it, to go through it. As you hear about these different fears, then you'll develop your subsection. And I would think that given the type of study like that, you would certainly be able to develop some nice solid rating criteria, code application criteria at the finer level there. So not just fears in general, but different kinds of fears that might be expressed by your research participants. So Megan asks, do we have any tips for simplifying a complex coding system, struggling with integrated reliability after a lot of practice? Megan, I think that's your red flag. If you're really struggling with it, the challenge can be addressed in a couple of ways. One is to work on looking at particular excerpts. Where are those problems taking place? And let me show you how we take advantage of our memo system in Dedoose. So memos in Dedoose are organized in a folder structure. And these are just some example memos that we've created here. And memos in Dedoose can be attached to any number of objects. So for example, and we use a lot of coding memos in our studies to address those particular things. So if we're struggling with integrated reliability, we might want to create memos as we're going through our data, different people on the team, and noting where we're having challenges, and then attaching those memos to the excerpts themselves, so that later on, if we've been working independently, we can pull all these memos out. So we have our notes about them, we have the example excerpts, and this is really what's important about taking things in and addressing them in a contextual way, because it's really maybe not our definitions that we're having problems sharing amongst our team members, but it's how do we really apply them when we're in our data. So where you continue to struggle with integrated reliability, if you can't refine the coding, then it really is a suggestion to you that you might want to pull back. Perhaps you're not tagging content that is going to help you tell your story in a consistent way. So it might be worth thinking about merging those codes together or deleting them entirely if you really can't hit it in a consistent way. And also then thinking about using those particular codes as tags, not worrying about integrated reliability at that level, but trying to hit it at that broader level where it's a little bit easier to tag content in those broader ways. Chantel asks, which chart do you use to analyze the presence of two codes, not on an excerpt level, but on a respondent level? That's an awesome question, only because we are developing new charts and visualizations in Dedoose all the time, and that is actually one that is on my desk at the very moment. We're going back and forth to develop a visualization that's going to give you that set of information. So we can work from the excerpts back to identify the participants from which they came. We don't have an easy way to do that in Dedoose at the moment, but that's something that is coming in the very near future. Stephen asks, is there ever a need to code a parent code along with the child code? That's a question that really can only be answered depending on your data analysis plans. Currently in Dedoose, there are a lot of data visualizations, and I can show you what this looks like, where we have an option to include subcodes. So here's a simple, let's just pull up child gender here. These are simple charts that show us the frequency of codes on based on child gender, so all of our codes represent the pairs of bars here. And I'm going to turn off my normalize and percent options here in Dedoose. And we can see here for reading by mother, where we do have child and grandchild codes, that for the count basis, we have 47 coded excerpts for females and 69 for males. Now I have a subcode count option here in this data visual. I'm going to click on that. These options are in the upper right corner there. And so what that's doing is folding up the tree. So here now, this bar represents the 80 excerpts coded for female participants with reading by mother or any of the child codes. And so we've essentially collapsed up the tree. So in Dedoose, if you're wanting to collapse those subcode counts, then there's an opportunity for you to do that in some of using some of the options in the data visualizations. Some people find that there's a little bit more flexibility by coding both at the parent and the child level. Sometimes people are using parent codes simply as organizers, so they're never actually coding excerpts at that level. They're simply using them as organizers in their code system. So it depends on what you're planning to do later on. Another feature actually that we're going to build into Dedoose is a toggle that simply lets you upcode, is what I'm referring it to. So if you're only coded at the child or grandchild level, but you find that at some point it would be useful to you to also have those excerpts tagged with a parent code, we're going to have a feature that allows you to simply just click a switch and it'll do that for you. And Shirley asks, how important is it to develop the parent codes first? You know, no rules about it. It really depends on your data and you know, how you want to approach it. So, you know, the right answer to how your code system is going to be built out, whether you're going to go into your data with a bunch of a priori defined codes, if you're going to develop them later, the structure of your tree. I think it really depends on how well you understand your data and how structured your data are. So if we're engaged in a study where we're putting a series of short answer questions out to our research participants, it might be much easier for us to go in a priori and develop these codes, knowing that that first pass of the day is going to be super easy, right? Because it's just short answer. We ask very specific types of questions. Boom, we know how to do that first pass. Even sometimes people will simply put a code number or question number as a code and tag that content initially that way, and then work on developing those more nuanced codes later on. For very unstructured data, running interviews and free conversations, then we're certainly going to have a lot more to learn about our data as we get into it, and then we'll have to develop the code system subsequently to that. Chantal asks, the numbers represented in the code co-occurrence matrix. So by default here, these numbers represent the number of times two codes are used together on specific excerpts or on overlapping excerpts. We have that option in the upper right corner here. So if I uncheck overlapping, we'll see those numbers drop. Now we're looking at the counts for explicit excerpts where we've used two codes together. The idea of including overlapping excerpts by default is that we're really using this matrix to understand how our research participants are talking about the different themes in one voice. So it may be interesting to us, for example, to note that when moms are talking about reading to their children, they're also talking about pre-writing activities on a fairly frequent basis. So that's one of the purposes of this matrix. But we can certainly uncheck our overlapping excerpts to get at the explicit excerpts on how we applied our code system and not simply how these themes are showing up in the context of our research participants reporting to us. Ed is asking, any plans to allow sending individuals a form to collect your data? Ed, I'm so glad you asked that question. Absolutely. We have a wonderful survey importer. So for data that are collected through SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or these other data collection services, we have a importer. Well, you can export your data from those services into Excel. We have a great survey importer that populates an entire project. From creating descriptors to tagging the qualitative and narrative content. We've got our eye on, and we're hoping that this will be released by the end of the year, so that you can simply build out the framework for your project, develop a survey within Dedoose, and then create a link that you can simply send out to your research participants. As they hit that link, respond to the questions that you've asked, whether they be demographics, ratings, or open-ended questions, that it'll populate that Dedoose project as they submit that. So yet to be announced, but there's your early warning that that's absolutely coming. And Peter's asking, for groups presenting frequencies, is it possible to count a code only once per case? And that's back to one of the other questions, and I'm forgetting who asked it. We're designing actually a new chart right now that's going to show you just that. So in our code application chart, for example, just pull that up. Here we're seeing by resource the frequency that particular codes were used. So we get down to some of our interviews here. So here for this particular interview, we see we've used the reading by mother code once and so forth. And I think what you're asking here, Peter, is to simply create a table where by descriptor or by document, we're simply have this table populated with ones and zeros, and that's absolutely coming. All right. Thank you so much for submitting the questions. And I think the last thing I wanted to show you, if you aren't familiar with it, is the Dedoose Training Center. And here is where we create tests to establish and work to maintain inter-rater reliability. So very quickly I can plop you into one of our tests. And what this looks like when these have been created is a test taker will go in, see excerpt content, apply codes as they see appropriate, but these are already excerpts that have been created and tagged previously, and then the results of which, and I'm going to just go through this, and I always do very poorly because I'm not paying any attention. I'm just deciding now as a test taker which codes are appropriate for them, and then when I finish, what we get in our results is Cohen's kappa coefficient for each of the individual codes, as well as a pooled kappa. 0.08, I'm definitely getting fired. And so built into Dedoose is this sort of one-off feature that allows you to create these tests. And the first thing that you do is you decide which of the codes you want to include in the test. So if we're building out a code system and we're not worried about hitting excerpts with those more nuanced codes, we really want to make sure that we can establish reliability at a certain level, be it parent codes or child codes. Then those are the ones that we're going to want to include in these tests. And it's great for working early on, and there's a variety of ways to approach this, pardon me, because my applying a code system and in terms of quality versus somebody else on my team early on while we're still developing the code system, it's really arbitrary as to who's the expert there and who's the trainer. So we can use this as a tool to help us early on explore how we're excerpting and coding in consistent ways. And then we can also build these tests up once we've established solid reliability to make sure that we're maintaining it. So even if you're working as an individual, and that was a question that came up earlier, you can create rating tests on excerpts that you yourself created. Go back and take the test, 3 months later and see if you've maintained that same consistency in coding. So tests can be taken multiple times, and we want to be able to do that so that we know that we've kept up a standard. If it's easy to remain consistent on applying codes to an interview 5 minutes after you applied them, but how about 2 hours later, and how about 2 weeks later? Are you still using the code system in the same way? This can be a nice place to make sure that you're maintaining those standards. So I think we are just about on it, and if there's any other questions coming in, please post them. I'm not sure if GoToWebinar is going to cut us off, but I want to thank everybody for your participation. Our topical webinars have had fantastic response, and we're really hoping that we're providing valuable and useful information for you. We certainly want to see you in Dedoose if it's appropriate for your work, but fundamentally we are educators, we are scientists, we want to support the development of knowledge. That is our business as academics, and it's a pleasure to have these opportunities to share our experiences and best practices in research to a broader audience. Again, thanks. Feel free to reach out to us at support@dedoose.com if you have any other questions. Alina will be your primary point of contact. So Alina, A-L-I-N-A, at Dedoose.com if you have particular questions. And we'll certainly be reaching back out to you to let you know when we've made the webinar recording available to you. If you're interested as well, you can certainly hit us up for copies of the slides that I presented to you today. And with that, I will bid you all adieu, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and happy research. Build those code systems. And signing off. Thanks, everybody.